All right, welcome everybody to today's lecture in the Extreme Belief and Behavior lecture series, the lecture by Dr. Julia Ebner. Nora Kieneman will introduce her in a second, but before she does so, a word on two upcoming events. The first one is something on conspiracy theories at a particular date, probably late June or early July. So that's all I can say for now. We're still working on that one. The other one is a little bit more specific. That is September 26th, 27th. The fifth and final workshop in the project, at least the formal one. This one is on resilience towards extremism, with such keynotes as Michelle Grossman, John Horgan, Beatrice de Graaf, Stijn Siekeling, and yours truly. I think it's going to be an exciting event, hybrid event. So if you're interested, sign up for that one. And there's also a call for abstracts out, made by Jacob, all horses over there. So yeah, two exciting events. And if you're interested, look them up at the website. And let me now hand the floor to Nora.
Yes. So thanks. Welcome again, everybody here and online. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker in this Extreme Beliefs lecture series. So today's speaker is Dr. Julia Ebner, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Kavala Research Center for Evolution and Human Science and the Center for the Study of Social Cohesion at the University of Oxford, where she also leads the recently created Violent Extremism Lab. She's also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and in her research, she focuses on radicalization, extremism, terrorism, conspiracy myths, and hate speech, specifically in the context of the UK, Europe, and North America. Julia completed her PhD in anthropology at the University of Oxford in 2023, and before that, she worked on for the Killiam Foundation and advised several governments, intergovernmental organizations, intelligence agencies, tech companies on issues such as terrorism, extremism, radicalization, and the prevention thereof. And on the side, I don't know how you do all that, she works as an investigative journalist and writer and regularly contributes to outlets such as The Guardian, The Independent, The Washington Post, and other outlets. She also shares her insights from her academic and journalistic research in several best-selling and award-winning books, the latest one of which was published in 2023 and was titled Going Mainstream: How Extremists Are Taking Over. Today, Julia will speak to us about the question, is there a language of terrorists? The floor is yours, and let me shift the laptop, and I hope the PowerPoint also works. So, cool.
Great. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here and that I made it in time, well, relatively in time. I'm really sorry to let you wait for a few minutes, but hopefully that's okay. Also, hello to everyone who's joining online. Today I'll be, based on the introduction, thanks a lot for all these kind words in the introduction. I'll be wearing more my academic hat, I guess, because the research presentation is mainly based on the research I did at the University of Oxford at the Center for the Study of Social Cohesion. So it's drawing on concepts from social psychology, but it used mainly methods from computational linguistics and digital ethnography, so kind of also anthropological methods. And but if you have any questions regarding my more investigative journalistic research and my books, you can also, of course, ask me maybe afterwards in the discussion. Yeah, so basically the aim of the project that I did there with my colleagues in Oxford was to find new ways of assessing risk that online users resort to extreme forms of violence in the form of terrorist attacks, but also in the form of other forms of political violence. And what we tried to understand is how can we distinguish people who are just basically trolling online, who might use empty threats, empty words, but never really turn their words into action, and the really credible threats, because that's, of course, one of the biggest problems also facing the security and intelligence community at the moment, as well as the tech platforms. But of course, yeah, they've been less, I guess, proactive in really tackling these issues. But so the starting point for this project was to develop a new form of assessing the risk of violence, to develop a new framework that is based on statistical analysis of psycholinguistic markers that we would see as most significant in the communication materials of terrorists. So maybe before I talk a bit more about the methods we used, I'll just say a few words about the theoretical background. So as I said, we're using concepts from social psychology, also from evolutionary and cognitive anthropology. And actually my PhD supervisor at Oxford, Harvey Whitehouse, he has worked for several decades on something called identity fusion. Maybe you've come across that. It's a social psychological phenomenon, for those who haven't come across it, whereby the personal identity becomes one with the group identity. And because of this oneness of the personal and the group identity, highly fused individuals are much more likely to commit extreme forms of violence or even martyrdom, terrorist attacks, basically on behalf of the group. So if you think about suicide bombers who are willing to put their whole life on the line for the group, often we would see that these people are highly fused with their in-groups. I'll say a few more words about the existing evidence for this link between identity fusion and violence in a second. But perhaps before I do that, we would distinguish between different forms of extreme group cohesion or group alignment. So of course, when we talk about radicalization, a lot of the literature refers to identification, which is one form of group cohesion, which is more on a, I would say, on a more superficial level, which is basically identifying with group norms, values, beliefs, and so on. And that has been shown to lead to ideological fixation. And it could, of course, be in an extremist context, ideological fixation on extreme beliefs, or also in a non-extremist context, ideological fixation on kind of any form of doctrine or belief system. And so that is potentially very closely associated with extremism, but not necessarily with violent action. Although we often see that identity fusion occurs together with identification. But identity fusion is a separate phenomenon which operates on a much deeper identity level, on a much more emotional level, and taps into, usually it's the studies that showed kind of the causes of identity fusion have linked it to shared forms of shared dysphoric or negative experiences within the group setting. So for example, in traumatizing war situations, but even in kind of the cases of, if you think about football hooligans, traumatic defeats, or even college fraternities, kind of escalations with other fraternities can lead to, or even the tough initiation procedures or hazing kind of standards are a form of shared negative traumatizing, depends on the individual how traumatizing they find it, but definitely a shared kind of dysphoric experience with the group that can lead to much stronger group bonds that could then manifest itself in fusion. So, and that fusion form of group cohesion has been shown to be much more linked to actual self-sacrificial violence and self-sacrificial violent extremism. Here you can see what this looks like if you depict it on a scale. Basically, most of us would probably sit somewhere with most of our kind of groups, or the groups we feel connected to. We would mostly probably sit somewhere at B, C, perhaps D, depending on how strongly we are bonding with a group. Whereas actually, identity fusion in itself is not necessarily negative. So it can also be the case with our families, for example. Most of us would be fully fused with our families. We would be 100% willing, or I can speak about myself, to put our lives on the line, to donate a kidney, to do something take a high risk to save a family member, to save, for example, our children or our parents even. So it's not necessarily, fusion alone in itself is not necessarily a predictor for something bad or something negative. But it's, so yeah, she would be a really highly fused individual. But what's been shown in the research, and that's something that Harvey Whitehouse in Oxford actually consolidated into a bigger framework, is that when identity fusion comes hand in hand with a few other factors, in particular with a perceived existential threat to that in-group that one is fused with. So he created a model called the fusion plus threat model. And he published a study in 2018 in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, where I don't know if you're familiar with that journal, but that's usually based on a big group of people who provide commentary, peer group commentary. So he also then brought all the peer commentary. I think there were over 30 peer reviews or peer commentaries for that article, and he kind of consolidated all of that and put it into an integrated framework where there were additional factors that were raised as kind of potentially relevant in that fusion to violence link. And so what I did for this specific project is that I created a hypothetical pathway to self-sacrificial violence. And by no means is this the only pathway, but it is something that we've seen in a lot of the cases. I'll go into that in a second. Where identity fusion in combination with other factors such as the perceived outgroup threat, which I just mentioned, but also additional factors like outgroup entitativity. It's a bit of a weird word, I agree. Basically outgroup othering. So kind of looking at the outgroup as a homogeneous group that is usually demonized or dehumanized, in some shape or form. And then violence condoning in-group norms. So for example, violence justification, martyrdom narratives, glorification of violent role models would fall into that broader category. And that these factors together are a bit like chemicals that taken individually, they're not necessarily toxic, but when they react together, they can become an explosive and can lead to self-sacrificial violent extremism. So that was the basis. And there has been quite some evidence collected in the past few decades about this fusion violence link. For example, in different cultural and geographic contexts, for example, in revolutionary battalions in Libya, in religious fundamentalist groups in Indonesia, even among football hooligans. So we're not just talking about the kind of extremist or ideologically extreme groups. Of course, you could argue that potentially hooligans also have a form of kind of extreme ideology, but not the ones that would be kind of typically on the radar of terrorism scholars. And herder farmer conflicts in Cameroon. So very strong kind of these in versus out group contexts where identity fusion has been shown to be really a significant trait of people who resort to violence. So we conducted several kind of studies, but we basically started with an analysis of terrorist manifestos, of a range of manifestos, terrorist manifestos, but we also had control groups of non-violent manifestos, so manifestos of authors who were ideologically extreme or ideologically moderate, so just political manifestos, but never used violence. So here you can see an overview of the manifestos that we looked into. So we started with the manifesto of Anders Breivik, 2011, and looked at the decade after that. So we included Elliot Rodgers' manifesto from the Isla Vista shootings, the misogynist terrorist, but then also Dylan Roof, Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter, then the Halle attacker, Stefan Bailey, John Ernest, the Poway synagogue attacker, Patrick Crusius, the El Paso attacker. And then we also had in the control group, or as kind of a different form of violent manifestos, we also featured Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, just to kind of have it as a way of comparing also how speech. I'll talk a bit more about heads of state later on, because that's something I'm actually looking at in my postdoc right now. But just to also have that in the overall group of violent manifestos. And then we also looked at non-violent ideologically extreme manifestos, as well as at ideologically moderate, just political manifestos, like obviously environmental manifestos like Greta Thunberg, but also the Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, so kind of feminist perspectives, anti-racist perspectives, and so on. And then we did a narrative coding for all of these manifestos, first in a qualitative way, and we conducted an intercoder reliability analysis using or having the help from 2 expert coders and 24 non-expert coders, who are basically students from King's College. And we had different narratives. Some of the ones you've seen on the previous slide, others were just drawn from basically the literature on terrorism motivations, terrorism causes and drivers. So we used the existing reviews of the literature and included the factors that we thought would be interesting to analyze here, or the ones that feature most prominently in the literature. So as you can see, I hope it's not too small, but identification and identifusion as the two forms of group cohesion, but also, of course, calls to violence, outgroup slurs, demonization of the outgroup and dehumanization, this existential threat perception, conspiracy beliefs, inevitable war narratives, so this idea of coming race war, for example, justification of violence, martyrdom narratives, violent role models, and hopelessness of alternative solutions. And we had in that intercoder reliability check, we had a really high reliability score of over 90% for most of the narrative categories. So we were happy to proceed with that coding framework. And we then found in the manifesto analysis that it was quite in line with what we had expected, so that identifusion was a really prominent marker and was actually something that was found in all except for one terrorist manifestos, and was not found at all in the non-violent manifestos. So it was completely absent in the non-violent ones, but it was there in combination with this existential threat perception, but also other. I have a few examples to show, but also the other factors that I mentioned, especially dehumanization of the outgroup, demonization, and violence condoning group norms. I'll show a little bit more in a second, but here are some examples of how I didn't really say anything about the linguistic proxies for these factors, but we also again used existing literature about how this can be measured in language, or how this usually manifests itself in language. And there has been a lot of research into fusion, being actually, as I said earlier, being kind of a form of becoming one with the group, but actually how that shows up in language is usually that people use kinship references to other members of the in-group, so that the in-group essentially becomes family and is seen almost akin to the biological family. So or also metaphors of shared blood would also often come up here. So, for example, what can this look like? In Breivik's manifesto, he would refer to our sisters. How many of our sisters, meaning white European sisters, have and will be raped by Muslims? So there's this threat, but also this identifusion proxy in there. Same was true for the Polway attacker, where you had the sentence in his manifesto, to the true Anons out there, you know who you are. You are the product of Pol, the product of unadulterated truth. You are my brothers and the best dudes out there. So my brothers, referring again to his in-group. Hitler also made repeated reference to the German brothers. These are just some examples, and I can give you more if you want to look into the other examples. Said Qutb, the Islamist kind of ideologue, and who also used violence, at least in a revolutionary sense, kind of wanted to overthrow the Egyptian government. He said, when the relationship of the belief is established, whether they are by any relationship of blood or not, the believers become like brothers. And Dylan Roof also had this reference to white blood worth saving in Uruguay, etc. So one of the caveats here is that in the Islamist or jihadist context, we actually have been quite careful, because there is more, it's more common to use words like aki, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but the Arabic for brother. And these kinship references can also be cultural, of course. So we would need to also find different linguistic proxies or ways of measuring that in language before we proceed with looking at specifically at jihadist communication materials in the lead up to violence. So now we actually focused more, as you could also see in the manifesto selection, more on far-right violent extremism and terrorism, which is also one of the reasons for that is also that we just have a lot more of these far-right terrorists actually published individual manifestos that they wrote themselves. So, of course, the jihadist groups often kind of well, they would often claim responsibility for an attack, or would say this was our soldier who committed that attack, but there was very often a singular, very rarely a singular manifesto written by the terrorist and published by the terrorist. The other relevant factors that we found in the manifesto analysis, you can see them here. The most important ones were demonization of the outgroup, dehumanization, martyrdom narratives, and so on. And we actually did an R-based NLP manifesto analysis that was kind of used complementary with the more qualitative analysis, where I showed you the examples from the qualitative text analysis. But we then want to test to what degree these findings are statistically significant. And actually, the most significant factors were indeed identity fusion. I'm just going to move this here. Identity fusion, which was found to be significantly higher in the violent manifestos than in the non-violent ones. And also outgroup slurs, demonization of the outgroup, dehumanization, violence justification, and hopelessness of alternative solutions were also found to be more prevalent. And as you would expect, violent threats were also more commonly associated, obviously, with the violent extremists. But that's not surprising in that context. Some of the conclusions that we took away from this, or some of the implications of this research, are that I would say that a lot of the, especially when applying it to a practical context, a lot of the security and intelligence agencies are right now still using, well, what I would call more old school methods of detecting risk of violence. So they would often take words at their face value. So they would look at explicit threats of violence. And we would argue that they're not necessarily always the best predictor if someone is really willing to commit an act of violence or not. So that's why we looked at the deeper psychological level as well. Because of course you have now this ocean of terrorist or violence threats online, where it's also a bit of a needle in a haystack problem for the agencies who don't really know what to focus their attention on. So we would never argue for this to become kind of the go-to framework or to replace manual investigations, but we think that it could potentially complement existing tools that are used. I would never I would never campaign for something like predictive policing. I'm actually quite critical of that, but I do think that it can help to allocate resources or shift resources in the right direction. And of course, traditionally, security services have also looked at things like weapons possession, which is now with the emerging technologies like 3D printers, but also do-it-yourself terrorism, the kind of make your own explosives at home. That trend, it becomes harder to actually assess if someone is in possession of a weapon, because it can happen really quickly and can be done at home. The second difficulty now is, of course, also that there is an emergence of a more post-organizational extremist space, that it's no longer really useful for the agencies to look at membership of specific groups, because a lot of these terrorists will have come from loose online networks. And thirdly, yeah, as I said, a lot of these threats are not really, might just be empty threats, or might be satirical, I mean, terrible in taste, but might be satirical or forms of trolling and gamified communication. So the advantage of our framework is also that it can be traced, that it's subconscious, so it can be traced in communication, whether that's propaganda, like terrorist manifestos are, of course, a form of propaganda, or whether that's more ad hoc chat log type of communication, and that it applies in different cultural, religious, and demographic contexts, with the caveat that I mentioned earlier, that in terms of the cultural context, fusion might show up differently, or we can't rely on these kinship markers. So what we did then in a second step, if there are any questions in between, by the way, I'm happy to I don't know, give me a hand sign or something. Also, anyone online who has a question in between, but otherwise, I just go to the end, get to the end of the presentation, and then we can have a discussion, I guess. Yeah, so the second part was then to apply this framework to online groups, to test it further and refine it further. And we then went into different far-right extremist groups across the violence spectrum. So where we knew some of them had been really strongly associated with violence and others not at all. And we also had control groups of just normal, average kind of discussion forums or boards. So specifically, we looked at the Iron March website, which is the violent neo-Nazi forum that has been very much associated with terrorist organizations, members of National Action, Atomwaffen Division, and so on, who were mainly using that forum. So also linked to real world, I don't like that term, to offline violence, to offline, because the online world is also real world, but the offline world of violence and terrorism. And then we also looked at the gaming app Discord, had several channels there. I'm going to show them in a second, but including the Charlottesville rally for chat groups and a few others that were to some degree associated with violence, but not to the same degree as the Atomwaffen Division / National Action Iron March kind of forum. And then we also had ideological, like religious discussion forums that were moderate, however, that were ideological, but they were not extreme in any shape or form and were not associated with violence. So we had the Mormon Forum Third Hour and Islamic Board, which is just a normal kind of Islamic community online. And we also had non-ideological online forums like the footballforums.net, which is basically a hobby community. And here we published two different studies, one specifically looking at the far-right, these far-right groups, applying this framework to different far-right groups, and the other one looked specifically at QAnon. And I'll talk a little bit about the QAnon case study, because what was interesting for us was that we didn't really anticipate how politically charged that whole debate is, of course, both and also unexpectedly, even in academia, there's kind of a huge division between some researchers who would label QAnon as a big security threat and others who would say this is actually not really a threat. But of course, there have been kind of real links to violence with the QAnon community. So at least 101 QAnon followers had committed crimes in the US by 2021. And over 60 QAnon adherents had participated in the Capitol riots, in the January 6th insurrection of the Capitol riot. And so, yeah, as you can see here, there is, I guess, an ongoing academic debate that's also reflected in a policy debate. So, for example, Amorasingham and Argentino argued that QAnon presents a novel challenge to the security forces and the domestic terror threat in the making. And Maskarenko and Macaulay, on the other hand, would call QAnon de-radicalization efforts a waste of resources and would say that they're potentially dangerous in exaggerating the QAnon threat. So quite a big divide there. And in the policy debate, that has also been reflected. Some countries have really strongly focused on making ideologically fluid or mixed, unclear, and unstable, MUU, that weird term that the Brits are using, making that a priority. Or I think in the US it's called salad bar extremism, and in Germany it's called anti-democracy, or no, it's Demokratie Delegitimierung, democracy. Most of you speak Dutch, so I don't have to translate. You know what I'm referring to. So they even in Germany they even included a new category, the Staatsdelegitimierer. Yeah, exactly. In 2021 for the security services to focus specifically on that, which also included the QAnon threat that was kind of emerging then. And the same is true for the Norwegian security services. They've also focused more on that space of QAnon and kind of anti-democracy extremism. But other governments have been very hesitant to even label them extremist. So the aim of this other part of the study, or of this specific sub-study, was to see, on the one hand, whether our model works in the context of QAnon, kind of situating it in that violence spectrum, also assessing to what degree should we see QAnon as a security threat, and we wanted to test our framework further and also refine it. And so we published a study in Perspectives on Terrorism. So we again, like in the previous study, we used both quantitative NLP methods based in R, and also complemented that with a qualitative digital ethnographic analysis of these channels that we examined. And we looked in the digital ethnographic research stream, we looked at 10 different QAnon groups from across the globe. So we looked at English, French, and German-speaking channels. We should have maybe included Dutch channels as well. I actually, when I went, this is on a separate note, but when I first went undercover with QAnon, kind of when it was at the starting point in 2017, there was one user in that group who was Dutch and who specifically wrote, "I want to start the Dutch QAnon movement." And like you could see months later on, the QAnon emerged in the Dutch context, in the Dutch language context. And I found it, I mean, terrifying, but also fascinating to follow that expansion of QAnon. And yeah, that Dutch user. I don't know if it was that Dutch user who really was responsible for the initiation in the Netherlands, but I guess it was fairly successful. Yeah, so we looked at these different channels, and we did an analysis also of 200,000 posts from, or messages from, the QAnon group, The Great Awakening, on Discord. And what we found was reflective or mirroring the offline links to violence of the different group of the Great Awakening community on the one hand versus our control group. So we used the very violent control group Iron March as a means of comparison, and of course there we had a very high risk marker based on our framework, and the Mormon discussion forum Third Hour, which was the non-violent control group, had a very low score, and QAnon was sitting somewhere in the middle. So that kind of reflected what we had expected. You can also see the individual markers that were where we calculated a weight score based on these variables that previously showed up as statistically significant, very significant, or slightly significant in the manifesto analysis. And then in the more qualitative findings, we saw that there are significant differences, however, when you really look deeper into the different channels. So some of the channels were associated with much higher proneness to violence or much higher predicted levels of potential violence, whereas others were rated quite low. And in general, the English language context was slightly more on the radical, potentially violent end of the spectrum. Here are some examples from the ethnographic research. So again, kind of that kinship language that came up in especially some of the QAnon channels, brothers and sisters, we are in a race war against time. We are in a race against time and the battle against sustained, relentless propaganda. So again, the threat in combination with the kinship language. Here is actually an example that refers to the brothers and sisters from the Netherlands, support them. We will not obey this mandatory vaccination and the fascistic COVID pass. We are all united. Again, threat and kinship language. And then look where we are, brothers and sisters. Would you have thought that we managed to get there? This is more of a positive shared experience that is highlighted there. And then also siblings of light or rest assured brothers and sisters. Yeah. So there are there were lots of different examples that showed this kinship language, and also some of the groups even called themselves the QAnon family, or even referred to this almost family-like group bond. And this is a bit offensive, but I'm sure you've come across similar types of language, and anyone going on the internet is anyways exposed to similar language. So I do show it here on the slide, but dehumanizing language was also something that featured very prominently. So of course, calling people filth or Satan, or calling people reptilians, basically subhuman, or comparing people to animals like rats or dogs and so on. And then of course, violence condoning norms, things like kill Gates, why isn't anyone killing Soros? Yeah, can I shoot them now? You see the types of language that we took into consideration for these categories. So in general, as I said, the English-speaking channels in particular showed a high level of violence, and we did find that our framework actually was working fairly well. I mean, it needs to be further tested, and we also, as I said, tested it in the range of far-right extremist groups, which was a separate study. And it also shows that potentially the research community, but also the policy community, should consider the new forms of defining what is extremism, especially when we look at these ideologically more fluid forms of extremism. I mean, there has been this term MUU, mixed, unstable, and unclear now, or salad bar extremism, but still a lot of the lists that at least the policy community looks at are very much far right, far left, and jihadist or religious fundamentalist groups. So it's something where we might see that there is an emerging threat of violence from these slightly less ideologically clear communities. Here are the related publications. And just what I wanted to mention in the end, before we go into the discussion, I hope its timing is good. Perfect. Is that now I'm working on a project that basically takes the question of what happens if extremists of some kind, whatever their ideologies, get into power and become heads of state. So I want to apply this framework and refine it and test it on state actors and heads of state who, first looking at a historical sample of leaders who have committed genocides, who have committed mass atrocities or war crimes or crimes against humanity, who've been charged by the International Court of Justice in the last century. So for especially the 20th century and the early 21st century, I now have a sample of leaders where I use archival resources of their kind of meeting transcripts, interview transcripts, speeches, and so on. And I test the framework on their communication materials to see whether there's a difference between non-state and state actors. And then the idea would be to then also apply that to the contemporary context, where I guess there's a lot of work, and it's a bit politically controversial. Obviously, this is an academic project, but still, it's of course something where, yeah, that might be interesting just to see from a psychological perspective.
Can you mention names already?
I mean, for the historical cases, I can mention all of them. So we have 10 leaders that we look at. Basically representatives or the ones that would be responsible for the Armenian genocide. We're starting with the Armenian genocide, so Talat Pasha. Obviously, we have Adolf Hitler in there. We have, we don't have Pol Pot because we now use, we are also doing expert consultations. So we're consulting 20 historians who are specifically focused on these leaders. Now coming up to the end of these consultations because they take a lot of time. But we specifically used the brother number 2. So Pol Pot is brother number 1, and we used the other person who was apparently more responsible for the actual violence, Nguyen Chea. And then we have who else? We have Hissène Habre. We have Theonestro Bagosora from the Rwandan genocide. We have Slobodan Milosevic from the Bosnian genocide, or Srebrenica. We have a few other cases there. Yeah, we have al-Bashir from Sudan, the Darfur crisis. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some. Pinochet. Yeah. It's of course not a complete list, but we want to have a representative sample from leaders across the world from different contexts. And then contemporary ones, maybe as a last sentence, we will definitely look into people like Kim Jong-un, Putin. But in the Middle East conflict, we will probably look at both sides to avoid any kind of politicization. So we would look at Hamas leaders, but also at Netanyahu. Then we also have other leaders that are on our radar where it would just be interesting to see, like Trump, for example. We just basically apply the framework and see what happens. We don't judge.